Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Judy Stone. I'm an infectious disease doc, and I was in solo practice in Cumberland for 25 years. I'm also the daughter of survivors of two notorious concentration camps, Auschwitz and Dachau. And as it turns out, today is Hungarian Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is kind of ironic because they were really, and still are, very anti-Semitic. I'm here to put a human face on what the Holocaust was and that it's real, and to show what it did to people, in hopes of preventing this from happening to anyone again. This is a picture of the little girl I'm going to be talking about primarily, though I'll also talk about my mother. But I want to give you a little background first. In Hungary, Jews were relatively sheltered from the war and fierce anti-Semitism until late in the war. The war started in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland in September, but Hitler left Hungary alone because he thought that they were allies. And I'm getting really hot, so I'm going to take that off. He thought that they were allies. He learned that the head of Hungary, the regent, was trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies, and he replaced him. So on March 19th, 1944, the Nazis invaded Hungary. So the Jews hadn't heard much about what was going on outside of their country because there was censorship. So they didn't really know very much about concentration camps or all of the persecution of the Jews before there. Because it was late in the war, the Nazis were in a hurry to exterminate the Jews and complete their goal of Judenrein, or becoming free of Jews. In just 8 weeks, more than 400,000 Jews were deported from Hungary. That's about the size of Miami, if you can imagine a whole city being deported in just a few weeks. Out of the 800,000 Hungarian Jews before the war, more than 2 out of 3 people didn't live, despite this being only 1 year before the end of the war. So Beth, the 2 people next to you might not have survived given the odds there. It was really only after my mom died in 2008 that I learned that fewer than 1 in 10 Jews from rural Hungary survived the Holocaust, and how remarkable our family's experience was. Because I grew up with aunts and uncles and didn't know how unique that was. My cousin Mari's story was even more unusual because she, her mother, and grandmother were all American citizens. And that's something I want you to understand how that happened. So you're probably going to wonder how an American girl ended up in a concentration camp. So let me explain. In order for you to better follow the story, I'm going to start with my great aunt, Mari's grandmother, Ilonka, the tall woman in the white blouse there. She immigrated to the US in 1894 with her husband to Amsterdam, New York, to work in her uncle's dry goods stores. He was well known in upstate New York, and he had a series of dry goods stores, and every time he opened a new branch, he brought over a relative from Hungary to manage the store. She and her husband became US citizens and had children here, but they went back to Hungary in 1910 for a visit, and after her husband died there, she ended up staying there. Her son, Jerome, the little boy there, and was now a teenager, and he went back to work with his uncle in Little Falls, but the little girl, Helen, stayed with her mom in Hungary. Helen grew up and got married, and Mari was born in Debrecen in 1939. She was registered then by her mother as a US citizen. I'm going to introduce you to the people I'm talking about here as we go through the story. So Helen, that was a picture of them in Debrecen. So here, Mari, the little girl, was this is after the war, so she was 7 at this point. Her father, the gentleman on the left, Jacob, raised my own father, who lost his father when he was a kid. And then you see there's Jacob, Helen, little Mari, and Ilonka, who's now grown into an older lady, despite the first picture. Not shown is my mother Magda, who Mari called Magda Nani, or Aunt Magda. These people you're seeing all lived through the war, which was quite remarkable. Now I'm going to start my story and tell you what Mari shared with me. And I'm going to talk to you as though she was talking to me in the first person. And when there are black slides, that's for important stories that I want you to think about. So on March 19th, 1944, my world changed as German tanks rolled into our beautiful streets of our capital, Budapest. A few days later, Hungarian officials told all the Jews throughout Hungary to wear yellow stars to identify us as aliens. I turned 5 during this time, and I didn't really understand what was going on and happening to us. I just knew they were forcing us apart. Other scary things happened. Jewish stores were vandalized, people were beaten up on the streets, and there were books being burned in the middle of the streets in big piles. I lived in Debrecen, the major city in eastern Hungary. We were sent in May from our homes and forced into a ghetto in a rundown part of the town. The Germans separated us from everyone else and even forced us to build a 9-foot high wall around us to separate us from the rest of the real Hungarians. It was very crowded, and we had to share flats with other people, and there wasn't much food, and there was poor sanitation, so many people became ill and died there. The other thing that I noticed is we didn't see very many young men. They were all off in the munkaszolgálat, which means in the forced labor units. And they were mostly sent to Ukraine to dig ditches, build roads, and do backbreaking work. Some were sent ahead of the Hungarian soldiers to detect landmines, and Aunt Magda's brother was blown up that way. On June 21st, we were all moved to the Surly Brickyard, along with Jews from the surrounding villages. The Germans used brickyards because there were already rail lines there, so it was easy to send us from the villages or towns to the concentration camps. It was so crowded, I was later told that there were more than 13,000 Jews packed in there, and so we didn't see other family members. There was no privacy and no cover in the brickyard. We were exposed to sun and wind and rain without shelter for days. About a week later, after soldiers stole our last valuables, we were forced onto cattle cars. There were about 100 people in each wooden boxcar. It was so crowded we could only stand. It was hot because it was summer, and there was little water and no food. There was just a bucket in the corner for pee and poop. And the smell was awful, can you imagine? We were kept in that car for 4 or 5 days, and that was the first time that I saw somebody who was dead. I learned that we were bound for Auschwitz, an extermination camp in Germany. I say extermination because Jews were viewed as vermin, or little more than insects, to be exterminated. There were a number of trains that went from Debrecen to Auschwitz. Ours was the only one that didn't get through. The rail lines had been bombed, so we were detoured, our train was detoured to Austria, and that detour is what saved my life. I later learned that all the kids who were on the trains that went to Auschwitz were killed immediately on arrival. After 4 or 5 days, we arrived at Strasshof. That was a big transit camp. That's a place where they sorted people and sent them to work in different towns and factories. It was scary in the sorting area because it was loud and it was crowded again, and there were these big German shepherd dogs, and they were almost as big as I was. So I was terrified when they growled and barked at me. My father was sent to a place called Treiskirchen, or 3 churches. The Nazis put all the men with advanced degrees to work digging ditches and doing other hard menial labor. While he was working, a guard struck him with a shovel and he developed an infected leg. My mother and I were sent to Lobau, a city of oil refineries. My mom was assigned to work making bricks in the factory, and Grandma Ilonka worked cleaning the officers' quarters every day. We stayed in crowded barracks, but the kids got to play outside. Not that there was anything to play with, but we were outside. We mostly ate a kind of mash left over from processing sugar beets. Grandma, she got to work in the officers' quarters, so she sometimes was able to bring home some potato peelings, so we had something more to eat. The head of the camp wasn't as cruel as many others we later heard about. He must have liked children because he gave us each about a half cup of milk every day, and that was a real luxury. My mom was even able to persuade him to let my father come back to us because I was so lonely and missed him so much. When my father came back, he was limping and in pain from this infection on his shin. So my mom cleaned old rags to wash and bandage his wound for him every day. While we were in Lobau, it seemed like we were being bombed every day by the Allies. I was a scrawny little kid, as you can see. I was a scrawny little kid, and I couldn't run very fast, so my father would hoist me up. No, sorry, my bad. My father would hoist me up on his back while trying to run to foxholes near the woods to escape the bombings. Now, my dad was almost 60 at this point, and he couldn't run very fast either because he had this wound on his leg, plus he was getting pretty old. And when we weren't quick enough, he'd throw us on the ground and try to cover us with the blanket that he'd taken from the barracks and hide us from the bombs under this blanket. You can imagine how effective that was. So we heard the bombs whistling by, and I could feel the ground shaking when the bombs hit near us. We spent the winter in Lobau. On March 27, 1945, the Nazis loaded us back into cattle cars again. We heard rumors that the train was going to take us to Bergen-Belsen, a far worse camp than we were in. Though this train wasn't quite as crowded as the first cattle cars from Debrecen, it was still pretty awful being locked into these big wooden boxes again. An Allied air raid struck the train, killing all the people in the wagon 2 cars ahead of us. I heard screams from the other people who were just as terrified and those who were hurt by the blasts. You could smell burning wood and burning flesh. The bombs were so strong that they twisted the rails up and broke off pieces of molten metal from the rails, and those flew into the nearby wooden buildings and the other wooden cars on the train and set them on fire too. Then I saw bloody, injured people all over the station area, and some who were dead. It was terrifying. I remember sitting on a knapsack at my grandmother's knee, and I clutched her and told her how afraid I am. You know, Grandma, Ilanka, what do we do? And my grandmother held me and tried to comfort me, and she said, I remember her saying, let us pray. God hears the prayers of little children. And we prayed, Ana Hashem Hoshiana, please God, save us. The Germans unlocked the doors of the cattle cars and they sent us back to the barracks, but they wouldn't let us help the people who were laying there who were hurt. A few days later, the Russians came and liberated us. I didn't understand why my mother became even more worried again, but I vividly remember her taking some soot and rubbing it on her face and on her clothes to make herself look unattractive and older. You can see on this map, going from Strasshof back to Hungary. My father, how far it was. It was about the distance from up here to DC. My father found a broken down wagon and a lame horse, and with another man we set off to go home, mostly by foot most of the way back. We only made it about 50 miles before the horse died. I guess that was an omen. And a kind farmer's wife let us stay in her barn and gave me a little bread and butter. And I remember that because I hadn't had anything that delicious for since the war started. I don't remember much of the rest of the long trip back to Hungary, but it was very hard for us to walk back most of the way. We made it to Budapest on May 8th, 1945. I remember that because it was my grandma's birthday. Other people remembered it because it was VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. We stayed in a Red Cross shelter in Budapest for a while, and my father got them to contact my mother's brother, Uncle Jerome, who still lived in Little Falls. He was able to send us some money to help us. We went back to Debrecen, which was another long trip, but we found people had taken over our old apartment and wouldn't leave, so we had to stay with other people, friends who had shared our apartment with us when we were in the ghetto. One day I was sitting by the window having my long curly hair brushed by my mother and put up into pigtails, and I glanced out the window and said, "Look, there's Magda." And of course they didn't believe me at first because I was a little kid, but they went and looked, and yes, indeed, that was Magda. It's amazing that I recognized my aunt because she was pregnant when I last saw her almost a year ago. She weighed about half of what she did before the war. My mom ran out and brought her back to the apartment. I quietly sat in the corner of the room playing while the women talked, so they would forget that I was there. Magda told my mother and grandmother about how, when she was in the brickyard, her baby had died in her arms. The brickyard had so many people that we hadn't seen each other, so we didn't know that. The Nazis then sent Magda to Auschwitz. She said that wasn't even the worst part for her. As the women chatted, I overheard Magda talking about the gas chambers and the other horrors at Auschwitz. And Mari said, she whispered to me, she said, for years afterwards, I was too afraid to go to friends' homes if they had a gas stove. When I was older, this is again Mari, when I was older, I heard that my mother tried to go to the American consulate in September to return to the States with me. They told her that they were too busy and told her to come back in December. There were elections in 1947, and Hungary was occupied by the Russians and under communist rules then. And there were pretty strict rules about what you had to do or not do. And one of the things that was required is it was mandatory to vote. I am not sure whether the penalty was going to prison or a big fine or what, but she just knew that she had to vote. And she waffled back and forth, Mari's mother waffled back and forth, what should she do? Because she knew she was an American citizen, but she also knew she had to vote. So she said, aha, I'm going to drop a blank piece of paper into the ballot box. And she was very proud at having come up with that idea. But when she went back to the consulate in December and told them what she had done, because she was incapable of lying, they said, you've lost your citizenship, and we're not going to let you leave. In the meantime, my grandmother had lost her citizenship papers too. We weren't quite sure how that had happened, but there was so much confusion around us that, that happens to a lot of people. There are fires or floods, or you're just moving around a lot, and you may not remember where you put papers. So she couldn't find her papers, and even though she'd lived in the US for about 15 years and her son was still there, the consulate said they couldn't verify that she was a citizen, so they wouldn't let her go to the States either. But when I was born, my mother immediately registered me with the consulate as a US citizen, and I was able to get a visa. In 1949, my grandma was now 70, Ilonka was now 70, and got a special visa for old people to leave Hungary. We flew to England and then got on a big ship. We had to share a cabin. It wasn't a real, like we had a fancy stateroom. We had to share a cabin with 5 or 6 other people who I didn't know. And I didn't speak any English, so my grandma got me a box of 8 colored crayons before we left to entertain me on that week-long trip across the ocean. And I remember having my first banana on that boat too, and just thought that was so delicious. It was heavenly. There's a manifest that shows that I was 10 at this time, and it shows my grandma being 70 when we came. That's a manifest of the lists of all the passengers that were on the ship. And when we arrived in New York, Magda and her husband met us in the New York City. As I said, they had arrived earlier in 1949, and they settled in New York City to be near relatives. Actually, they were supposed to go to Little Falls too, but my cousin had measles, and so they wouldn't let him stay. They wouldn't let Magda stay in Little Falls, so they went back to other relatives in New York City. So I was excited because I had a little new cousin to play with in the States. Soon we went to Little Falls to live with my Uncle Jerome and his family. And I guess the younger one is, actually the bigger one is the one who I'm still in touch with, and is the one who had measles. Moving to a strange country without my parents was hard, and it was lonely at first because I didn't speak any English. I didn't look like the other kids either. My clothes were different. I remember in Little Falls I wore heavy knitted long stockings and these high-topped shoes, and I couldn't get in and out of them very readily. So the teacher told my uncle that he had to get me some more suitable clothes. And I was so excited when he got me an American snowsuit that I could put on and off by myself. I was supposed to start school in the 6th grade, but they put me in the 3rd because I didn't speak English. I quickly learned and was moved to the 4th grade, but then they still made me stay there with all the younger kids. It was okay, we got along okay. And we stayed friends for the rest of my life. After high school, I went to nursing school, and then I became a school nurse because I always liked children. One of the things that still makes me sad, though, is that I wasn't able to see my parents again for almost 10 years, until 1958. They had to apply to immigrate as Hungarian Jewish refugees, and by the time they did, the wait was almost a decade. No country wanted to take the Jews. So I grew up with my grandma, separated from my parents for almost 10 years. After coming to the US, my father, who was a lawyer in Hungary and was now 68, worked various jobs. He worked first as a delivery boy on a bicycle, bicycling around Manhattan with packages, and then as a night watchman and a bookkeeper. My mother, Helen, worked as a nurse's aide. They did anything to support us. And you can see how much they aged. Go back, Mark, to the picture of the two of them. You can see how much they aged in the 10 years. It's going forward, sorry. One more. Look at the difference in the 10 years between how that family looked in 1947 and how they looked in 1958. It's really quite shocking to me to see how much they'd aged during that period. We remained devout throughout our lives, and we were very observant Jews and attended services religiously. In the 1990s, I suddenly recognized these prayers, which are psalms in a special holiday service called Hallel, and they're prayers of thanksgiving that we'd been chanting for years. Suddenly, I recognized that these were the same prayers I'd said some 50 years earlier when I was so terrified. Ana Hashem Hoshia Na. Please, God, save us. And I cried at the flashback. The trauma of the Holocaust never leaves you. So I want to turn back for a moment to Magda and share a couple of photos. This is a picture of my parents in 1941. And again, you can see how young and vibrant they looked. Next, please. This is my grandfather on the left, who, as I say, was a decorated officer and was murdered on arrival at Auschwitz. And on the right is my grandmother, Ella, and her son, Jenner, who was killed. And one of the things that was peculiar for me is really not understanding the concept of having grandparents. That was an alien concept. I didn't know when other kids talked about visiting their grandparents. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I was really glad that my children were at least able to know some of theirs. Next, please. This picture was in the Denver Post in 1952. Wasn't I a cute little kid? The Denver Post ran a spread about Nazi survivors starting a new life in a new country. And this was it was a really very nice article. And that was one of the pictures they had. And when I asked for permission to use it, they had no record of having had it, which was interesting. Next, please. These are my relatives that I grew up with at my wedding in 1984 in Cumberland. And Queen Elizabeth, or Betty as she was known, is the one with the high-topped hair on the left. then Kati, who was the youngest sister, my mother, Clary, who was hidden during the Holocaust, and Ella, the only one that doesn't have white hair, the brunette there. She was one of the women who helped save my mother in Auschwitz and held her up and otherwise protected her. And then a brother is in the back next to Ella. So was very gratifying to see them all together. And that, as I say, that's what I grew up with, so I didn't know how unusual that was. Next picture. So that was at my wedding. This is a picture of my mother with my newborn son. Do you remember him, Bill? I think you were there then. And as I look at this picture now, I wasn't really aware of it at the time, but as I look at this picture now, I think, was my mother really able to be there and enjoy holding her newborn grandson? Or was she back in the ghetto and the brickyard thinking about her baby who had died in her arms? And I know, again, I didn't know at the time that I had that delivery. But I didn't have any pain meds either, thanks to a certain someone. And how much that must have rekindled for my mother what her experiences were like in the ghetto, having the baby and being so isolated. Next picture. I wanted to leave you with a few pictures. One of the things that my mother stressed was how important kindnesses of people were to them and the people who helped save them throughout the war. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of pictures of that. Kati, as I said, was 18 when she was put in a concentration camp, and before, when she was still in her little village and was on house arrest in her village, she was afraid that she was going to be raped by the soldiers there. And the man you see on the left there, Totbachi, or Uncle Mike in English vernacular, he lived across the dirt road. He was a very poor guy in a small shack, but Kati would go over there every night and sleep on the dirt floor under his bed with the chickens running around her. But he protected her every night until she was deported from her village. And had he been caught, he would have been killed. Both of them would have been killed. So it's quite remarkable that he did that. Yeah. This lady, I went back to Hungary in 1978. My mother had discovered the brother that had been blown up in the Ukraine had an illegitimate son. And he discovered my mother and reconnected with my mother in 1977. She hadn't known anything about him. And it was the strangest thing because it happened because somebody recognized him and said, "Oh, you must be one of the Ehrenfelds. You look so much like other people in that family." And so they put them in touch with my mother, and we went back to meet him. And my mother said there were a few people she wanted me to go and track down for her. And this lady was one of them. And I went all over Debrecen knocking on doors. Does anybody know this lady? She was one of 12 kids, so I figured somebody might know the family. And sure enough, they turned her up. And when I looked at her, I thought, what's the big deal? Why does my mom want to see her? She's kind of dumpy and matronly like I am now. And what did she do that mom wanted to see her? And it turns out that Birgi, or Betty in English, Birgi had offered Kati her identification card so that Kati could try to pass as Gentile. And she had brought my mother food in the ghetto. And the few pictures and a couple of pieces of jewelry that were left, that we still have, she had hidden under the thatched roof of her house. And even though they were dirt poor, they gave all these things back to my mother. And their delight when they found each other was really something to behold. In the plaque on the next to Birgi was a teacher who would climb over the fence to climb over the fence to get to my grandfather and Kati in their house when they were walled off. Because in Sharan there was no real ghetto; it was their house, and they moved people from the surrounding area into their house. And he would climb over and bring them some food and some money that they were owed and news. And when who knows what happened, but when Kati was deported, he committed suicide. And we really don't know whether somebody had ratted him out and he was afraid of being arrested or what had happened. Next, please. The woman that you saw in my wedding picture is the woman on the left there who married my mother's brother. And these two women, they were sisters, and they were in Auschwitz and helped my mother. And Miri, who ended up being a chemist, she was one of the women who was at the university in Debrecen and was thrown down the stairs because somebody didn't like that a Jewish woman was there, and was injured doing that. There are other people listed there who again were big helps to my family in various ways. Policemen who offered to smuggle my mother out of the ghetto and hide her in the woods, but she was too afraid to do that because she was so close to delivery. He brought her some baby clothes in the ghetto and some food. There's a man at the bottom who Mr. Hudmashi, he took, my grandfather gave him some money, and Mr. Hudmashi sewed it into the soles of my grandfather's shoes. And when they were on the train going to Auschwitz, the soldiers said, "You better give us all your valuables. No, this is your last chance to give us all your valuables." And my grandfather did that, and surprisingly, the soldier actually gave him several loaves of bread, and that he shared with the people in the car. So at least, as Kati said, at least when they got to Auschwitz, they didn't die starving when they were killed. Next. And so these were some of my mother's messages about kindness that she wanted to relay to people. Not that we're all the same, and this is really, if there's anything that you take out of this from what's going on in our country now, we're all the same, and we all have the same needs and wants. And don't be a bystander. And she stressed the importance of kindness and the importance of reading. Next, please. So if anybody has any questions, this is my book. I have some copies here. If you know other people who might be interested in a talk like this for churches or schools or whatever organizations, I would be more than happy to help to give programs and modify it for, as is desired. If people have questions, you can email me. My email is on there. And thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Showed your family kindness, have you sent them to Yad Vashem?
We did. And Totbachi, who hid Kati under his bed, was named one of the righteous Gentiles by Yad Vashem. They wouldn't take the other people. They said that their kindnesses weren't big enough, but that he, by risking his life every night doing that, and yeah. And that was really something very important for her, so I was glad we were able to do that. Yes, Bob?
Just a little bit about yourself. How do you get from a little village in eastern Hungary to, for example, an Indian reservation in North Dakota? How do you do that?
No,
So
I was born here. I was the American baby, born in 1952. So I think it happened in a couple of ways, and that's an interesting question because all of the kids, not all, most of the kids, my mother and her siblings, most of the kids went into helping professions, nursing or teaching or as physicians. A couple of math computer nerds, but for the most part, helping professions. And that was one of the things that was instilled in us, I think, was wanting to help other people. The other thing, I can't say my mother beat into me because that's not the right word. She didn't beat me, but just reading. She wanted us reading constantly and asking questions, which isn't always an endearing quality, I know, but asking provocative questions. And I know one of the things, and to be politically engaged, pay attention to what's going on and how people are treated. And so that's some of how I ended up going to medical school. And then I wanted to serve in an underserved area. And so I settled in Cumberland because at the time I went into practice, there was no infectious disease doc between Morgantown and Baltimore. And when I started in practice, I drew patients from Petersburg and a huge, huge radius. And so that's how that's evolved. Yes?
Was your parents' story, have they been documented in the survivors of the Shoah?
I'm sorry, they documented?
Were they documented by Steven Spielberg's survivors of the Shoah?
My mother made a tape, which I don't like at all. It's very, and I've seen this, I've watched a number of tapes now, and I've seen the ones I've watched are all so unemotional, very unemotional. It's like you're talking to a zombie recounting these facts that happened. And I know when she practiced or when they went over what questions they were going to ask her, she didn't have that. But when the actual taping started, there was a mask, and that was true with others. So not all of my relatives did that. My father died when he was 50. He dropped out of a heart attack, and so he didn't do that. And that was another huge loss for my mother because she was the only one who lost a spouse too after having lost her baby. But not all of them wanted to do the Spielberg tapes for various reasons. Some did, some didn't.
Thank you.
Yeah. Annie?
What is it like for you to do that, to tell these stories?
It's very hard. It stirs up a lot. And at the same time, I feel more driven to do it now than I did a few years ago because of what I see going on around us. And all the hate mongering and the anti-immigrant. I think one of the things I should say is, one of the things people don't understand is that immigration is legal and seeking asylum is legal, but you have to be in the US to seek asylum. And so if you keep the migrants in Mexico and don't let them into the States, then they can't legally seek asylum. And having seen so much of my family turned away, or the problems that they had getting here, it makes me much more sympathetic to immigrants than many of the people who surround me are. But it's very hard, and that's why I ask if there are other people who who would like speaking, like to hear me or engage in an exchange. That's why I want to do that now, despite it being hard, because we need this now more than ever. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.